Are you going to starve me like they did? A homeless girl whispered on a freezing night in the mountains, and the rugged man before her broke down in tears. He thought his days of family and faith were long behind him. But when this starving child stumbled into his cabin, the fire she lit in his heart would change everything. What seemed like a simple act of mercy soon became a fight against the law itself, because this girl carried more than hunger. She carried a secret, a forgotten promise, and a claim powerful men would do anything to bury. With townsfolk whispering, a county agent circling, and the church bell tolling judgment, one broken man must decide. Will he risk everything to protect her, or lose the only second chance God ever gave him? The storm is closing in. The law is closing ranks. The girl's voice still echoes. Are you going to starve me like they did? And the question left hanging is this: can one man's tears and one girl's courage stand against the whole frontier? Every time I see your comments, I'm reminded how stories connect us across distances, backgrounds, and hearts. If values like respect, courage, and compassion still guide you, then you're part of this story too. The wind howled through the cracks of Mark Harlow's lined shack like a hungry wolf, but he barely noticed anymore. 10 years of mountain winters had taught him to ignore such things. His calloused hands moved mechanically, stirring the pot of beans warming on his pot-bellied stove. The spoon scraped against iron, a lonely sound that echoed off rough-hewn walls. The day's work of cutting wood had left his muscles aching. Snow had started falling heavy that afternoon, coating the Colorado highlands in thick, white silence. Mark had managed to drag enough logs back to keep warm through what promised to be a bitter night. He was just about to settle down with his meager supper when he heard it, a whisper of movement near the door. His hand instinctively reached for the rifle propped in the corner, but something made him pause. The sound was too slight for a bear, too hesitant for a wolf. The door creaked open, letting in a swirl of snowflakes and a small, dark figure. Mark stood frozen, watching as a child slipped inside like a shadow. She couldn't have been more than 12 years old, her frame so thin it seemed the wind might snap her in two. Her clothes were little more than rags, dusted with snow. In her dirt-streaked hands, she clutched a piece of hard bread, clearly stolen from his modest stores. Their eyes met across the lamp-lit cabin. Hers were deep and dark, carrying a wariness that no child should know. Mark recognized the look of someone ready to bolt, like a rabbit sensing a trap. He'd seen that same fear in the eyes of wounded animals. When he took a step forward, meaning only to keep her from fleeing back into the deadly cold, she pressed herself against the rough wall. Her small body trembled, though whether from cold or fear, he couldn't tell. Are you going to starve me like they did? The whispered words hit Mark like a physical blow. His chest tightened as memories he'd tried so hard to bury came rushing back. Sarah, his own daughter, had been about this age when the fever took her. He remembered her small hand in his, growing colder despite his desperate prayers. The grief he'd pushed down for so long bubbled up like a spring breaking through ice. His legs wouldn't hold him anymore. Mark sank to his knees, feeling tears freeze in his beard. The girl watched him with those hollow eyes, clutching her stolen crust like it was gold. Without a word, he reached for his plate of beans and held it out to her. She didn't move at first, studying him with the cautious calculation of one who'd learned the hard way not to trust easily. The warm aroma of beans filled the small space between them. Finally, hunger won out over fear. She inched forward, ready to sprint at the slightest threatening movement. When she took the plate, her hands shook so badly that some beans nearly spilled. Mark stayed very still, watching as she crouched in the corner and began to eat with desperate speed. "Slow down," he said softly, his voice rough from disuse. "There's plenty more." The girl paused, bean juice running down her chin. She had features that spoke of mixed heritage, high cheekbones and copper skin that hinted at native blood, but also the lighter hair of European ancestry. Her face was smudged with dirt, but underneath lay the gauntness of one who'd gone too long without proper food. Outside, the storm raged on, rattling the shutters. Mark moved slowly to the stove, careful not to startle her, and ladled more beans into a second plate. He settled onto his wooden stool, leaving plenty of space between them. They ate in silence, broken only by the crack and pop of the fire. The girl's movements gradually became less frantic as she realized the food wasn't going to be snatched away. When she finished, she set the plate down carefully and drew her knees up to her chest, watching him with those unnervingly adult eyes. "What's your name?" Mark asked, keeping his voice gentle. She hesitated, fingers picking at a hole in her threadbare dress. "Lisa," she finally whispered. "I'm Mark." He gestured to the pot. "Would you like more?" Lisa shook her head, though her gaze lingered on the food. Mark recognized the look, the fear of asking for too much, of wearing out welcome. He'd seen it in his own mirror often enough after losing his family, when neighbors tried to help and he couldn't bear their pity. "Where did you come from?" he asked, though he had a fair idea. The nearest town was 30 miles away, and he'd heard whispers of how they treated half-blood children there. "Nowhere," she said, her voice barely audible above the wind. "Everywhere." Her shoulders hunched. "They didn't want me." The simple statement carried volumes of pain. Mark felt something crack in his chest, a wall of ice he'd built around his heart starting to thaw. He remembered Sarah's favorite doll, still tucked away in a trunk he couldn't bear to open, the way she used to sing to herself while helping her mother with the washing, the empty silence after they were both gone. "You can stay here tonight," he found himself saying. "Storm's too bad to go anywhere else." Lisa's eyes widened slightly, hope warring with suspicion on her face. She glanced at the door, then back at him, clearly weighing her options. The wind howled particularly fierce just then, making her decision easier. Mark stood slowly, joints creaking, and went to the trunk in the corner. He pulled out a worn quilt his wife had made years ago. The fabric still held traces of lavender from her washing, though the scent was faint now. He offered it to Lisa, who took it with trembling fingers. "You can sleep by the stove," he said. "It'll be warmest there." He busied himself banking the fire for the night, giving her space to arrange herself. When he glanced over, she had wrapped herself in the quilt like a cocoon, only her face visible in the dying lamplight. Her eyes tracked his every movement, but some of the raw fear had faded. Mark settled into his own bed, a narrow cot against the far wall. He didn't expect to sleep much. Too many memories crowded his mind, too many ghosts stirred up by this unexpected visitor. But as he watched Lisa's breathing slowly even out, something else stirred in his heart, something he thought had died with his family, a need to protect, to care for someone besides himself. The lamp burned low, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Snow continued to fall outside, but inside the cabin a fragile warmth had begun to grow. Not just from the stove, but from the simple act of sharing food with another soul. Mark thought of all the meals he'd eaten alone, telling himself he preferred solitude. Now, watching this wounded child find brief sanctuary in his home, he realized how hungry he'd been for something besides food. Lisa made a small sound in her sleep, curling tighter into the quilt. Mark found himself humming softly, an old lullaby his wife used to sing. The familiar tune filled the cabin like a prayer, weaving between the storm's fury and the fire's crackle. For the first time in years, the line shack felt less like a fortress against the world and more like what it was meant to be, a shelter, a place of refuge. Neither of them knew what morning would bring. The storm might pass, leaving them to face difficult decisions. But for now, in this moment, something precious and fragile had been born in the sharing of a simple meal, a connection, tenuous as spider silk but just as real, stretched between two broken hearts. And in that connection lay the seeds of healing, waiting to take root in fertile soil of compassion. Mark closed his eyes, his wife's quilt wrapped around a child who needed it more than his memories did. The wind's howl seemed less lonely now, less like a wolf at the door, and more like a lullaby of its own. In the morning, they would have to face the world again. But for now, this was enough. This quiet sharing of warmth and food, this small rebellion against the coldness of the world. For now, they could both rest, knowing they weren't alone in the vast wilderness of their grief. Dawn crept over the Colorado highlands with reluctant fingers, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pale gray. Inside the line shack, Mark Harlow stirred the dying embers in the pot-bellied stove, adding small pieces of kindling until flames licked upward. The familiar motions felt different this morning, weighted with purpose he hadn't felt in years. His gaze drifted to the small bundle of quilts near the stove. During the night, he'd risen twice to wrap another blanket around the sleeping girl when the temperature dropped. Now only her face was visible, peaceful in sleep despite the hardships etched into her young features. The cabin's floorboards creaked under his boots as he moved to put coffee on. The sound made Lisa startle awake, her body tensing like a spring ready to flee. Her eyes darted around the unfamiliar surroundings before settling on Mark, with a mixture of wariness and desperate hope. "Morning," he said softly, keeping his movements slow and predictable as he reached for the coffee pot. "Sleep all right?" Lisa sat up, clutching the blankets around her shoulders. She gave a small nod but didn't speak, watching him with the careful attention of someone used to reading adults for signs of danger. "Breakfast'll be ready soon," Mark continued, measuring coffee grounds into the pot. "Got some cornmeal mush and dried apples. Not fancy, but it'll warm you up." The mention of food made Lisa's stomach growl audibly. A flush crept across her cheeks, but Mark pretended not to notice. He busied himself with breakfast preparations, heating water and stirring the cornmeal into a smooth porridge. The familiar tasks helped ease the awkwardness between them. When he set a steaming bowl in front of her, Lisa's hands trembled slightly as she took the spoon. She ate with the same desperate speed as the night before, though she tried to hide it behind careful manners. Mark settled onto his stool with his own bowl, giving her space. "Reckon we should know each other's names proper," he said after a while. "I'm Mark Harlow." Lisa swallowed her mouthful of mush, studying him. "Lisa," she whispered finally. Just the one word, no family name offered. "That's a pretty name," Mark said. He waited a few more spoonfuls before asking, "Where you headed, Lisa?" She stirred her porridge, shoulders hunching. "Nowhere special." Mighty cold to be traveling nowhere special. He kept his voice gentle, non-judgmental. "Someone waiting for you somewhere?" Lisa's spoon clattered against the bowl. "No," she said, the word sharp with pain. "My step-uncle left me behind on the trail. Said I was—" Her voice caught. "Said I was just another mouth to feed." Mark's hands clenched into fists, rage burning in his chest at the cruelty of abandoning a child to the wilderness. But he forced his voice to stay calm, knowing Lisa would interpret any anger as directed at her. "No one deserves that," he said quietly. "No one at all." Tears welled in Lisa's eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely. Her fingers worried at a loose thread in one of the quilts, betraying her anxiety. "Well," Mark said after a moment, "storm's passed, but it's still bitter cold out there. Wouldn't be right to send you out in it. How about you stay a spell, at least till it warms up some?" Lisa's head snapped up, surprise and suspicion warring on her face. "Why?" she asked, the word holding years of learned distrust. Mark considered his answer carefully. "Because it's the right thing to do. And because—" He paused, the truth rising unexpectedly. "Because this cabin's been mighty lonely these past years." Something in his voice must have convinced her, because Lisa gave a tiny nod. Her shoulders relaxed fractionally, though she remained alert. "Could use some help with the morning chores if you're willing," Mark said, standing to clear their bowls. "Nothing too hard, just bringing in some kindling, washing up these dishes." "I can work," Lisa said quickly, eager to prove her worth. "I'm strong. I can do lots of things." "I believe you can," Mark said. "But there's no hurry. Get warm first." He showed her where to find the dish soap and extra towels, demonstrated how to pump water from the indoor pump he'd installed years ago. Lisa absorbed his instructions with intense concentration, clearly determined to do everything exactly right. As morning stretched toward noon, Lisa slowly began to move more naturally around the cabin. Her movements were still cautious, but less like a trapped animal and more like someone testing new ground. When Mark showed her how to stack kindling just so beside the stove, a brief smile flickered across her face at the crackling fire. They worked in companionable silence through the afternoon, Mark showing her simple tasks and Lisa completing them with careful precision. He noticed how she kept the stove between herself and the door, how her eyes tracked every movement he made. But there were moments when her guard lowered slightly, when she hummed under her breath while drying dishes, when she paused to watch snowbirds at the window. As dusk approached, Mark prepared a simple stew from dried meat and vegetables. The familiar motions felt different with another person in the cabin. When the food was ready, he ladled it into 2 bowls and set them on the small table. Before eating, Mark found himself bowing his head. Words of prayer rose to his lips, surprising him with their presence after so long absent. "Lord," he whispered, "thank you for this food, for shelter from the storm, and for bringing this child to safety." He glanced up to find Lisa watching him intently, her own head slightly bowed in mirror of his posture. Something about her careful attention made his throat tight with emotion. They ate their stew in the growing darkness, until Mark lit the lamp that cast a warm glow through the cabin. The storm had eased outside, leaving a hushed stillness broken only by the occasional crack of frost-heavy branches. Lisa helped him clear the dishes, then settled back near the fire, drawn to its warmth. Mark took his usual seat in the old rocking chair, noticing how she seemed more relaxed in its gentle creaking presence. The firelight played across her features, softening the wariness there. For the first time, Mark could see past the layers of fear and hunger to the child underneath, one who still held hope despite everything she'd endured. A deep certainty settled in his heart as he watched her. This wasn't chance that had brought her to his door on that stormy night. Someone had guided her here, to this moment, for a purpose he was only beginning to understand. They sat in comfortable silence, the fire casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the wilderness stretched vast and cold, but inside the cabin a fragile sense of safety had begun to take root. Like a tender shoot pushing through frozen ground, it would need care and protection to grow. But for now, in this moment, it was enough. The morning sun glinted off fresh snow as Mark checked the cinch on his saddle. 2 days of waiting had cleared the skies, but the cold still bit fierce. He glanced at Lisa, who stood watching him from the cabin doorway, her thin frame swimming in his old wool coat. "Gotta head into town for supplies," he explained, adjusting the stirrups. "Running low on flour and lamp oil. You'll ride with me." Lisa's eyes widened with alarm. "I can stay here," she offered quickly. "I won't touch nothing." Mark shook his head, remembering the preacher's warnings about lone children and wild animals. "Too dangerous by yourself. Besides," he added gently, "you need proper clothes. Can't have you wearing my old things all winter." She hesitated, then nodded, though her shoulders remained tense. Mark helped her mount, settling her in front of him on the saddle. The horse, Button, shifted under their combined weight but stayed steady. They set out along the trail, ice crackling beneath Button's careful steps. Mark kept one arm around Lisa to steady her, noting how she gradually leaned back against him for warmth. The morning air stung their faces as they wound through snow-laden pines. "Town's about 3 hours' ride," Mark said, his breath forming clouds. "Place called Silver Creek. Not much to look at, but they've got what we need." Lisa didn't respond, but he felt her stiffen slightly at the mention of town. He understood her wariness. Silver Creek wasn't known for welcoming strangers, especially those who looked different. The sun climbed higher as they descended from the highlands. Mark pointed out landmarks, the lightning-struck pine that marked the halfway point, the three-pronged rock formation that looked like a crown. Lisa absorbed it all silently, her eyes taking in every detail. By mid-morning, the first buildings of Silver Creek came into view. Smoke rose from chimneys against the crystal-clear sky, and the sound of hammering carried from the blacksmith's shop. Mark felt Lisa press closer to him as they approached. The main street was relatively quiet, but the few people out stopped to stare. Mark noticed Mrs. Peterson pause in sweeping her porch, her eyes narrowing as they passed. Outside the general store, two men stopped their conversation to watch, their expressions guarded. Mark helped Lisa dismount in front of Tompkins' mercantile, pretending not to notice how she tried to hide behind him. The bell above the door jangled as they entered, and old Mr. Tompkins looked up from his ledger. "Mark Harlow," the shopkeeper said, his usual welcome tone slightly cooler. His gaze settled on Lisa. "Been a while since we've seen you in town." "Need some supplies," Mark said evenly, setting his list on the counter. "Flour, lamp oil, sugar if you've got it, and some clothes for the girl." Tompkins' eyebrows rose. "Girl's clothes, is it? And who might this young lady be?" Before Mark could answer, the door chimed again. Reverend Stevens entered, stamping snow from his boots. His kind face brightened at the sight of them. "Mark, good to see you, brother." The preacher approached, nodding to Lisa. "And who do we have here?" "This is Lisa," Mark said simply, not offering more explanation. "Lisa, this is Reverend Stevens." The preacher smiled warmly. "Welcome to Silver Creek, Lisa. We're glad to have you." Lisa managed a tiny nod, but stayed close to Mark. He could feel her trembling slightly as Tompkins began gathering their supplies. The Reverend drew Mark aside while Lisa examined a display of colored ribbons. "Mark," he said quietly, "word travels fast in small towns. There's already talk about where she came from. Some are saying she looks like an Indian stray." Mark's jaw tightened. "She's a child who needs help. That's all anyone needs to know." "I agree," Stevens said gently. "But be careful. You know how people can be. There might be accusations, theft, vagrancy. The law's not always kind to those who look different." Mark nodded grimly. He knew the Reverend meant well, but the warning settled like lead in his stomach. They finished their shopping quickly. Mark paid for flour, oil, sugar, and some basic clothes for Lisa, 2 dresses, warm stockings, and a coat that actually fit her. She touched the fabric wonderingly when he handed her the bundle. "Thank you," she whispered, the first words she'd spoken since they'd arrived. The afternoon stretched before them, and the horse needed rest. Mark led them to the boarding house, where Mrs. Wilson gave them a long look before agreeing to serve them dinner. The dining room was half full when they entered. Conversation died down as heads turned to study them. Lisa kept her eyes on her plate as Mark helped her to portions of beef stew and cornbread. "Heard you've taken in a foundling, Mark," Henry Watson called from 2 tables over. His voice carried clearly in the awkward silence. "Just helping someone in need," Mark replied shortly, focusing on his food. "Mighty Christian of you," Watson continued, "though some might wonder about taking in strays without proper papers. Could be trouble there." Mark set down his spoon, meeting Watson's gaze steadily. "There's trouble in turning away those who need help, too. Seems to me that's worth considering." Other diners shifted uncomfortably. Lisa had stopped eating, her shoulders hunched as if trying to disappear. Mark noticed Mrs. Wilson watching from the kitchen doorway, her expression unreadable. They finished their meal quickly. Mark settled the bill while Lisa waited by the door, clutching her bundle of new clothes. The sun was setting as they mounted up for the ride home, casting long shadows across the snow. The return journey was silent. Lisa's body remained tense against him, and Mark's thoughts churned with the day's events. He'd known there would be challenges, but the open hostility in some faces had surprised him. He'd lived apart so long, he'd forgotten how quick people were to judge. By the time they reached the cabin, the moon had risen, casting silver light across the snow. Mark tended to button while Lisa carried their supplies inside. When he entered, she had already changed into one of her new dresses and was carefully folding her borrowed clothes. "You can keep those too," he said. "Never know when spare clothes might come in handy." She nodded, smoothing the fabric with careful fingers. "The people in town," she said softly, "they don't like me." Mark's heart ached at the matter-of-fact tone in her voice. "They don't know you," he corrected. "People fear what they don't understand. But that's their problem, not yours." He helped her make up her bed near the stove, adding an extra blanket against the night's chill. Soon her breathing deepened into sleep, but Mark remained at the table, staring into the lamp's flame. The Reverend's warnings echoed in his mind. He had no legal claim to Lisa, no papers to prove guardianship. If someone chose to make trouble, to question her presence or his motives, what defense did he have? Yet looking at her sleeping form, peaceful for perhaps the first time in months, he knew he couldn't send her away. Whatever came, he would have to find a way to protect her. The question was how to stand against an entire town's prejudice when he barely knew how to be around people anymore himself. Mark rubbed his tired eyes, remembering the whispers, the stares, Watson's pointed comments. The lamp oil flickered low as he sat deep in thought, wrestling with fears he thought he'd left behind years ago in his solitude. Now those fears had taken new shape, centered not on his own survival, but on the safety of the child sleeping trustfully across the room. Dawn crept over the mountains, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold. Mark stood at his cabin door, breathing in the crisp morning air. The sound of hoofbeats made him turn his head sharply. A lone rider approached along the narrow trail, his dark coat and official-looking hat marking him as a stranger to these parts. Inside, Lisa was sweeping the floor, humming softly to herself. The domesticity of the scene made Mark's chest tighten. It had been so long since his cabin had felt like anything more than a place to sleep. The rider drew closer, his horse's breath forming clouds in the cold air. Mark stepped forward, positioning himself squarely in front of the door. The stranger reined his horse to a stop, looking down with cold authority. "Mark Harlow." The man's voice was clipped, precise. "I'm Randall Pierce, county agent for this territory." Mark nodded once, saying nothing. He'd dealt with government men before. They always brought trouble. Randall dismounted, his polished boots crunching in the snow. "Word reaches me you're harboring a vagrant child. I'm here to investigate the situation." "She's not vagrant," Mark said firmly. "She's under my care." "Under whose authority?" Randall pulled a leather folio from his saddlebag. "I see no record of legal guardianship. No adoption papers. No family connection." Inside the cabin, the sweeping sounds had stopped. Mark knew Lisa was listening, probably pressed against the door. "She needed help," Mark said. "I gave it. That's all there is to know." Randall's lips thinned. "That's not how the law works, Mr. Harlow. I need to see the girl." "No." Mark's voice was quiet but hard as iron. "This isn't a request." Randall stepped forward. "The county has a duty to ensure proper placement of orphaned children. The next orphan train leaves from Denver in 2 weeks. She'll be placed with a proper family back east." The door creaked open behind Mark. Lisa stood there, her face pale but determined. Her hands clutched the broom handle like a shield. I ain't going on no train, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Randall's eyes narrowed as he studied her. Half-breed by the look of it, all the more reason for proper placement. These mixed children need structure, civilization. Mark's hands clenched into fists. She stays here. Mr. Harlow, Randall's tone grew sharp. Perhaps you don't understand. The law gives me authority to remove children from unsuitable situations. A single man, living alone in the wilderness, hardly appropriate for raising a young girl. The law also says children can't be taken without cause, Mark countered. She's fed, clothed, safe. For now. Randall's smile didn't reach his eyes. But what happens when winter truly sets in? When supplies run low? When she needs schooling, medical care, proper guidance? Lisa moved closer to Mark, her small hand finding his sleeve. He could feel her trembling. I suggest you reconsider your position, Randall continued. The county has ways of dealing with those who obstruct official business. It would be a shame if your trapping licenses came under review, or if questions arose about your land claims. Mark stood very still, aware of Lisa's grip tightening on his sleeve. Are you threatening me, Mr. Pierce? Merely stating facts. Randall adjusted his gloves. I'll return in 3 days. Have her ready for transport, or face the consequences. He mounted his horse with practiced efficiency, turning the animal's head back toward town. 3 days, Mr. Harlow. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. They watched him ride away, his straight back rigid with authority. Only when he disappeared around the bend did Mark feel Lisa's grip loosen slightly. You won't let him take me? Her voice quavered. Like freight on a train? Mark turned to her, kneeling down to meet her eyes. No, little one, you're not freight. You're not something to be shipped away. Tears welled in her eyes. But he said the law. The law's meant to protect, not harm, Mark said firmly, and sometimes men like him forget that. They spent the day in quiet activity, Mark splitting wood while Lisa helped stack it, both of them working together to patch a drafty spot in the cabin's wall. But Mark could see the worry in her eyes, the way she kept glancing down the trail as if expecting Randall to return. As evening approached, Mark prepared their usual stew, adding extra dumplings, something he'd noticed made Lisa smile. They ate by the warmth of the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. Thank you, Lisa said suddenly, her voice soft. For the stew? Mark asked, though he knew that wasn't what she meant. She shook her head. For standing up to him. For wanting me to stay. Mark's throat tightened. He covered it with a gruff chuckle. Well, who else is going to help me stack wood so neat? Besides, you're getting right handy with that broom. A small smile tugged at her lips, but her eyes remained serious. He'll come back, though, won't he? Likely so. Mark saw no point in lying to her. But we'll face that when it comes. Lisa nodded, returning to her stew. Soon after, her eyes began to droop, the day's tension taking its toll. Mark helped her settle into her bed near the fire, tucking the blankets around her shoulders. Once her breathing deepened into sleep, Mark retrieved his axe and whetstone. The familiar rhythm of stone against steel helped order his thoughts as he worked in the firelight. Randall's threats echoed in his mind. The county agent had power, real power, backed by law and government. Mark had seen others broken by such authority, their lives torn apart by official papers and cold regulations. But looking at Lisa's peaceful face in the firelight, he knew he couldn't yield. She'd been cast aside too many times already, by her step-uncle, by townsfolk, by a world that saw her as something less than whole. The axe blade gleamed as he tested its edge with his thumb. Not a weapon, never that, but a tool, like the strength in his hands and the determination in his heart. Tools to build with, to protect with. Not again, he whispered, more prayer than promise. She won't be cast aside again. The fire crackled softly, and Lisa stirred in her sleep, murmuring something he couldn't catch. Mark set aside the axe and whetstone, settling into his chair to watch over her through the night. Outside, an owl called across the snow-hushed wilderness, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf answered. But inside the cabin, there was warmth and safety, and the fierce, quiet certainty of a man who had found something worth fighting for. Morning light filtered through frost-covered windows, painting the cabin's interior in soft golden hues. Mark stirred the embers in the stove, adding fresh kindling to chase away the dawn chill. Lisa watched from her blankets, her dark eyes following his movements with growing familiarity rather than fear. "Reckon we need some eggs for breakfast," Mark said, pulling on his heavy coat. "Old widow Jensen down the path, she keeps chickens. Might be willing to spare some." Lisa sat up, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. Could I go get them?" Mark paused, studying her face. A week ago, she would have shrunk from any suggestion of leaving the cabin. "You sure about that?" She nodded, though her fingers twisted in the shawl's worn fabric. "I'm good with animals. My mother taught me about talking gentle to them." "All right, then." Mark reached for his money pouch, counting out a few coins. "Mrs. Jensen's likely up already. Just follow the path past the big lightning-struck pine. Can't miss her place. Got a red door." Lisa tucked the coins carefully into her pocket, pulling on the 2 large boots Mark had found for her. She hesitated at the door, glancing back as if making sure he wouldn't disappear while she was gone. "Go on now," he encouraged softly. "I'll be right here fixing up some coffee." The door closed behind her with a gentle click. Mark moved to the window, watching her small figure make its way down the snowy path. Her steps were more confident now, no longer the desperate stumbling of a starving child. 20 minutes later, Lisa returned, her cheeks pink from the cold and her eyes bright with accomplishment. She held up a basket containing 6 brown eggs. "Mrs. Jensen said these are fresh laid," she announced proudly, "and she showed me how to check if they're good by holding them up to the light." Mark smiled, taking the basket. "That's fine work. You did real well." After breakfast, Mark led Lisa outside to the woodpile. "Time you learned another useful skill," he said, selecting a small axe. "Every cabin needs kindling, and every pair of hands can help make it." He demonstrated the proper grip, showing her how to split smaller pieces from the larger logs. Lisa's first attempts were awkward, the axe glancing off the wood at odd angles, but she persisted, her tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. "Like this?" she asked, managing to split a piece cleanly. "That's the way," Mark encouraged. "You're getting the hang of it." They worked together through the morning, Lisa's pile of kindling growing steadily larger. Once she missed completely, the axe striking dirt, and the look of dismay on her face was so comical that Mark couldn't help chuckling. After a moment, Lisa joined in, her laughter ringing clear in the winter air. As the sun climbed higher, Mark noticed Lisa's swings becoming tired. "Think that's enough for today?" he said. "Come on inside. Got something else to show you." In the cabin's warmth, Mark retrieved a well-worn Bible from his trunk. The leather cover was smooth with age, the pages marked with his late wife's neat notations. He ran his fingers over the familiar texture, memories stirring. "My Sarah," he said quietly. "She taught our Jenny from this very book, taught her letters and numbers, and the good Lord's words all at once." Lisa settled beside him at the table, her eyes wide. Will you teach me too?" Mark opened the Bible carefully, turning to the first page. "That's just what I aim to do. Now, this here's the letter A ... Lisa proved an eager student, though the letters often confused her. She traced them with her finger, mouthing the sounds, frowning in concentration when they wouldn't come clear. "Don't fret," Mark assured her when frustration brought tears to her eyes. Took Jenny near a month just to learn her alphabet. You're doing fine. Each small victory, a letter recognized, a simple word sounded out, brought a glow of pride to Lisa's face that warmed Mark's heart. They worked through the afternoon, stopping only when the light grew too dim to see clearly. As days passed, their life fell into a gentle rhythm. Mornings began with chores, afternoons with lessons, evenings with quiet companionship by the fire. Mark found himself speaking more, sharing stories of his life before the mountains claimed him. Lisa listened intently, sometimes offering shy tales of her own, memories of her mother's songs, of desert flowers blooming after rain. During supper one evening, Mark found himself speaking words he hadn't uttered in years. "Lord," he began hesitantly, "we thank you for this food and for bringing us together." He opened his eyes to find Lisa watching him intently, her own hands folded in mirror of his pose. Something loosened in his chest at the sight, a knot of grief he'd carried so long he'd forgotten its weight. The days lengthened into a week, marked by small changes. Lisa's face filled out, losing its haunted hollowness. She moved through the cabin with growing confidence, anticipating tasks before Mark could ask. Their meals, once silent affairs, now held conversation and even laughter. One night, as snow fell thick outside, they sat close to the fire. Lisa was practicing her letters in the warm light, while Mark mended a tear in his coat. The quiet was comfortable, broken only by the crack of burning wood and the scratch of Lisa's pencil. "Pa?" The word was so soft, Mark almost missed it. But when he looked up, Lisa was watching him, her face a mix of hope and fear. The needle slipped from his suddenly trembling fingers. He turned away quickly, but not before Lisa caught the gleam of tears in his beard. "I'm sorry," she whispered, starting to withdraw. "I shouldn't have—" "No," Mark managed, his voice rough. He reached out, catching her small hand in his calloused one. "No, little one, it's just right." Lisa's fingers tightened around his. "Really?" Mark nodded, not trusting himself to speak. After a moment, he cleared his throat. "Reckon that's what I am now. Your pa." The fire crackled warmly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Lisa leaned against Mark's shoulder, still holding his hand, and returned to her letters. Mark watched her bent head, seeing not just the girl she was, but the woman she might become. Strong, educated, loved. Outside, wind whispered through pine boughs heavy with snow. But inside the cabin, warmed by firelight and something deeper than flame, two souls who had lost everything found themselves building something new. A family, grown not from blood, but from choice, from trust, from love that could heal the deepest wounds. Lisa yawned, her head growing heavy against Mark's arm. "Pa?" she murmured sleepily. "Will you teach me more letters tomorrow?" "Every day," Mark promised softly, "for as long as you want to learn." He helped her to her bed, tucking the blankets around her shoulders as he had done each night this past week. But tonight, before he could step away, Lisa caught his hand again. "Thank you," she whispered, "for wanting me." Mark bent and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, the first time he had dared such tenderness. "Sleep well, little one. Pa's right here." He settled in his chair by the fire, watching the flames dance. The Bible lay open on the table, its pages filled with Sarah's careful notes, waiting to guide another child toward knowledge and faith. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, more lessons, more chores, more moments of learning to be father and daughter. But for now, in the quiet of their cabin, Mark listened to Lisa's steady breathing and offered up a silent prayer of gratitude. The mountain winds might howl outside, but within these walls, two lonely hearts had found their way home. The cabin creaked in the deepening night. Mark had just settled into his chair by the dying fire when a sound from Lisa's bed made him pause. She tossed restlessly, her breathing shallow and quick. Setting down his mending, he crossed to her side. "Lisa?" he whispered, touching her forehead. Heat radiated from her skin, and his heart clenched with worry. She mumbled something incoherent, her face flushed with fever. Mark's hands shook as he lit the lamp, memories of another night, years ago, when Jenny had burned with fever. He pushed the thoughts away. This time would be different. "Hold on, little one," he murmured, rushing to fill a basin with water from the bucket. The night air bit cold through the cabin's walls as he moved quickly, gathering what he needed. He soaked clean cloths in the cool water, wringing them out before placing one gently on Lisa's forehead. Her eyes fluttered open, glassy and unfocused. "Mama?" she whispered, voice cracking. "It's Pa," Mark said softly, his throat tight. "I'm here, Lisa. You're safe." He needed willow bark tea, the only remedy he knew for fever. His late wife had taught him well about frontier medicine. Moving to his herb shelf, he located the dried bark he'd collected last spring. His hands trembled as he measured portions into the kettle. Lisa's voice drifted through the darkness, words in Apache he didn't understand, calling for someone lost to her. Mark's chest ached as he stoked the fire, willing the water to boil faster. While the kettle heated, he changed the cloth on her forehead, murmuring quiet comfort when she stirred. In his haste to reach for fresh linens, he bumped against Lisa's small sewing bag, knocking it from its perch near her bed. The contents scattered across the plank floor. Scraps of fabric, a worn thimble, bits of thread. As he gathered them up, his fingers brushed something different. A folded paper, yellow with age, tucked beneath the cloth pieces. Mark hesitated. It felt wrong to pry, but something about the document's official look made him pause. Moving closer to the lamp, he carefully unfolded the brittle paper. His eyes widened as he read the formal heading. United States Department of Interior, Bureau of Indian Affairs. The kettle's whistle pierced the air, making him jump. He quickly set the paper aside to tend to Lisa, pouring the hot water over the willow bark to steep. When he'd helped her drink a few sips of the bitter tea, he returned to the document, his hands shaking for a different reason now. The treaty paper was dated 15 years earlier, its text dense with legal language. But the meaning was clear enough. It detailed land and water rights granted to Lisa's mother's family along the Sweetwater Creek. Prime grazing land, with year-round water access. Mark's mind raced. This wasn't just any piece of paper. This was Lisa's inheritance, her birthright. Lisa whimpered in her sleep, drawing his attention back. He smoothed her sweat-dampened hair, replacing the cooling cloth. "I'm here," he soothed. "Your pa's right here." Through the long night, Mark kept his vigil. He spooned willow bark tea between Lisa's cracked lips whenever she stirred, changed the cool cloths, and prayed like he hadn't prayed in years. Between these tender ministrations, he studied the treaty document by lamplight, his heart growing heavier with each reading. The paper promised not just land, but protection, rights that should have shielded Lisa from the very abandonment she'd suffered. Mark thought of the county agent's threats, of the townspeople's suspicious glares. This document could change everything. It could give Lisa a future, a place of her own. But it could also bring danger. Land rights meant money, and money meant trouble. There would be those who'd try to take advantage of a young girl's claim, especially given her heritage. Mark had seen it before, how greed could turn seemingly decent folks cruel. Dawn's first gray light filtered through the cabin's window. Lisa stirred, her fever finally breaking. Her eyes opened, clearer now but heavy with exhaustion. "Mama?" she whispered again, voice small and lost. "I dreamed of Mama singing." Mark's heart twisted. He took her small hand in his. "Your mama's not here, little one," he said gently. "But you're safe. I promise you that." Tears slipped from Lisa's eyes, and Mark gathered her carefully into his arms, letting her cry against his shirt. When her tears subsided, she drifted back to sleep, her breathing easier now. Moving quietly, Mark retrieved his Bible from the shelf. The leather binding was worn smooth with use, its pages familiar under his fingers. With reverent care, he slipped the treaty document between its pages, where it would stay hidden and protected until the right time came. Returning to Lisa's bedside, Mark lowered himself to his knees. The morning light strengthened, painting the cabin's walls with pale gold. His calloused hands, so used to rough work, clasped together in prayer. "Lord," he whispered, voice rough with emotion, "protect this child. Give me the wisdom to guard her future and the strength to stand against whatever comes." He paused, words catching in his throat. "And thank you. Thank you for trusting me with her care." Lisa slept on, her face peaceful now as the fever released its hold. Mark watched over her, his protective resolve hardening into something as solid as the mountains themselves. The treaty document might be hidden in his Bible, but its weight pressed on his heart, a responsibility as sacred as the fatherhood he'd accepted. The morning sun rose fully, warming the cabin's weathered walls. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and steady, but inside, father and daughter rested in the quiet aftermath of night's battle, bonds strengthened by trust and tender care. Mark knew the document's discovery changed everything, raised the stakes in ways he'd never imagined when he first opened his door to a starving child. But looking at Lisa's sleeping face, he felt no regret, only certainty. Whatever storms this paper might bring, they would weather them together. He reached out to adjust her blanket, his touch gentle as a blessing. "Sleep now, little one," he murmured. "Your pa's watching over you." The winter sunlight filtered weakly through frost-covered windows as Lisa lay bundled in quilts, her fever finally broken, but leaving her weak as a newborn fawn. Mark stirred a pot of chicken broth, carefully skimming the surface. The rich aroma filled the cabin, but he knew from experience that too much too soon would do more harm than good. "Just a little at first," he murmured, carrying a tin cup to her bedside. "Small sips now." Lisa's thin fingers trembled as she reached for the cup. Mark steadied her hands with his own, helping her raise it to her lips. After 2 careful sips, she lay back, exhausted by even that small effort. "That's good," he encouraged. "We'll try more in a while." Over the next 3 days, Mark watched her strength return bit by bit. He rationed the broth carefully, increasing the portions as her body grew stronger. By the 4th morning, she managed to sit up on her own, propped against the headboard with pillows. "Pa," she said quietly, her voice still rough from coughing. "Why did you look so worried when you found that paper in my sewing bag?" Mark settled into the chair beside her bed, his weathered face serious. He'd been waiting for the right moment to explain, and perhaps this was it. From his shirt pocket, he withdrew the treaty document, now carefully folded in clean cotton. "This here," he said, unfolding it with reverent care, "is a promise from the government. It's about land and water rights that belong to your mother's people, which means they belong to you now." Lisa's brow furrowed as she tried to understand. "Land? You mean like where we are now?" "No, little one. This speaks of land along Sweetwater Creek, good grazing land with year-round water." He pointed to the flowing script. "See here? It's all written proper and legal. This paper says you have a right to that land, same as any settler with a deed." "But," Lisa's voice wavered, "if it's mine, why didn't anyone tell me before?" Mark's jaw tightened. "Some folks might not want you knowing about it. Land with water rights. That's worth more than gold out here." Before Lisa could respond, a knock at the door made them both start. Mark quickly tucked the document away, rising to answer. Sarah Jenkins from the neighboring homestead stood there, a covered dish in her hands. "Thought you might need some proper food," she said, peering past him to where Lisa sat. and I wanted to see how the child was faring. We've all been so worried. Mark accepted the dish with careful politeness, noting how Sarah's eyes darted around the cabin, taking in details. Much obliged, he said, not inviting her in. But Sarah lingered. Some folks were wondering. The girl, she's part Indian, isn't she? Which tribe? There's been talk about treaties in these parts. She's my daughter now, Mark said firmly. That's all anyone needs to know. More visitors came as the day wore on. The miller's wife brought cornbread, asking pointed questions about Lisa's background. The blacksmith's son delivered shoes his mother had found while trying to learn how long Lisa had been traveling alone. Each time, Mark's answers grew shorter, his shoulders tenser. Lisa watched from her bed, understanding more than she let on. She saw how these neighbors who'd never shown interest before now couldn't seem to stay away. The sun was setting when hoofbeats announced another visitor. Mark's face hardened as Randall Pierce dismounted, his official badge catching the last light. "Evening, Harlow," Randall said, not waiting for an invitation to step inside. "I see our young ward is recovering." "She's not your ward," Mark said quietly. "She's my daughter." Randall's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Now, let's be reasonable. A single man living alone can't properly care for a child, especially one with her complex situation." "Her situation isn't complex at all," Mark replied. "She's here, she's cared for, and she's staying." "Ah, yes, staying." Randall moved closer to Lisa's bed, making her shrink back against the pillows. "Tell me, child, did your mother leave you anything? Any papers, perhaps?" Mark stepped between them. "You know about the treaty." "Treaty?" Randall's fake surprise fooled no one. "Oh, you mean that old piece of paper she's been carrying? Won't matter much once she's under territorial authority. Indian rights don't extend to wards of the state. Get out." Mark's voice was deadly quiet. "Think carefully, Harlow." Randall straightened his vest. "Fighting the territory over this will only make things harder. For everyone." His smirk spoke volumes as he turned to leave. The door closed behind him with terrible finality. Mark sank into his chair, the weight of the threat heavy on his shoulders. The cabin grew dark as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, but neither of them moved to light the lamp. Finally, Lisa's small voice broke the silence. She slipped from her bed, crossing the floor on unsteady feet to stand beside him. Taking his rough hand in both of hers, she whispered, "Don't let them take me." Mark's voice broke as he gathered her close. "Never," he promised. "They won't take you from me, not ever." Lisa buried her face in his shirt, her tears dampening the worn fabric. Mark held her, his own eyes wet, feeling the fragile trust she placed in him. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin's walls. But inside, father and daughter clung to each other, defying any force that would tear them apart. "We'll find a way," Mark whispered into her hair. "Whatever it takes, we'll find a way." The lamp remained unlit as darkness settled fully over the cabin. But in that darkness, their bond grew stronger, forged in shared fear, strengthened by mutual need, and sealed with a promise that neither would let go. The Sunday morning dawned crisp and clear, with frost sparkling on bare branches like scattered diamonds. Mark helped Lisa into his best coat, which swallowed her small frame but kept her warm. They'd spent an hour earlier getting ready, Mark combing his beard, and Lisa carefully braiding her hair with ribbons the preacher's wife had given her. "You look right pretty," Mark said gruffly, touched by how she'd tried to smooth every wrinkle from her worn dress. The ride to town was quiet, their horses' hooves crunching through patches of leftover snow. Lisa sat in front of Mark on the saddle, watching the church steeple grow larger as they approached. The white wooden building stood proud against the winter sky, its bell silent until service time. "Ain't been inside proper for years," Mark admitted as he helped Lisa down. His hands trembled slightly as he tied the horse to the hitching post. The last time he'd attended regular services had been with his late wife. The preacher, Reverend Thomas, met them at the door before the other townspeople arrived. His kind eyes crinkled at the corners as he welcomed them inside. "Brother Mark, young Lisa, come in where it's warm." The church interior smelled of pine boughs and beeswax. Sunlight streamed through frosted windows, casting rainbow patterns on the wooden pews. Lisa touched one of the colorful spots with wonder. "Reverend," Mark began, his voice rough with emotion, "we need your counsel. It's about Lisa's rights, and doing what's proper before God and man." They settled in the preacher's study, a small room off the sanctuary filled with books and warmed by a pot-bellied stove. Mark pulled out the treaty document, handling it carefully as he explained their situation. The preacher listened intently, his weathered face growing grave. "This is serious business," Reverend Thomas said finally. "Treaties are sacred promises, though too often broken. We must handle this with wisdom." Before he could continue, boots scraped on the church steps outside. A tall figure appeared in the doorway, Henry Yazzie, the Ute Scout known throughout the territory for his tracking skills and quiet wisdom. His dark eyes took in the scene, settling on Lisa with gentle understanding. "I heard talk in town," Henry said simply. "Thought you might need a friend who knows about treaties." Mark stood, relief washing over his face. He'd known Henry for years, trading with him occasionally, but never fully appreciating the man's deeper knowledge until now. Lisa surprised them all by slipping from her chair and approaching Henry. Something in his calm presence drew her, reminding her perhaps of her mother's people. Henry knelt to her level, offering his hand palm up in greeting. She placed her small hand in his without hesitation. "You carry heavy medicine," Henry said softly, gesturing to the treaty. "Papers like that need many eyes to witness, many voices to speak truth, else they fade like morning mist." The preacher nodded thoughtfully. "Henry speaks wisdom. A treaty hidden away is too easily ignored, but brought to light before the whole congregation." He paused, considering. "That would be harder to dismiss." "The agent, Randall, he's threatening to take her," Mark said, his voice tight. "Says treaty rights don't matter for wards of the territory." Henry's face darkened. "I know this story too well. My people have seen many promises written on paper, then scattered like leaves in wind." He squeezed Lisa's hand gently. "But when promises are spoken before Creator and community, they grow stronger roots." The church bell began to toll, calling the faithful to worship. Reverend Thomas rose, straightening his collar. "Stay for service," he said. "Afterward we'll share dinner at the parsonage and make plans." The morning service passed in a blur of hymns and prayers. Lisa sat between Mark and Henry, her back straight despite the curious glances from other worshippers. Mark noticed how she followed the singing carefully, her small voice joining in when she recognized words from their evening Bible readings. As the congregation filed out, Reverend Thomas invited several respected elders to join them for dinner. Soon they were settled around the parsonage table, where Mrs. Thomas had laid out a feast of roast chicken and winter vegetables. Henry waited until grace was said, then spoke with quiet authority about treaties he had seen honored and broken. His words painted pictures of promises made beside campfires, of land measured in horizons rather than fences, of people who viewed water as life itself rather than property. "The paper Lisa carries," he explained, "speaks of rights that cannot be divided from the land itself. Like cutting water from the river, it cannot be done without destroying both." Lisa listened intently, her food growing cold as she absorbed every word. Mark watched her face change as understanding dawned. This wasn't just about her, but about promises bigger than herself. "I remember when I first came to these parts," Mark admitted, shame coloring his voice. "Had some hard thoughts about Indian folks. Didn't understand about treaties or promises. Thought the land was just there for taking." He looked at Henry. "I was wrong about a lot of things." Henry acknowledged this with a slight nod. Understanding comes slow sometimes, like spring after long winter. But it comes— What matters now, Reverend Thomas interjected, is how we proceed. I propose we present the treaty before next Sunday's congregation. Let it be witnessed properly, with God and community as witness. The agent won't like it, Mark warned. No, Henry agreed, but he will have to face more than one man's word against his own. He will face the truth spoken in God's house, before God's people. As the winter afternoon waned, they crafted their plan. The preacher would speak of promises and their keeping. Henry would testify to the treaty's meaning and worth. Mark would stand as Lisa's protector, declaring his intent to adopt her properly. The sun was setting as Mark and Lisa mounted up for the ride home. Henry helped Lisa adjust her shawl against the evening chill. "Be brave, little sister," he said softly in his own language. Though she didn't understand the words, she felt their blessing. Stars were beginning to peek through the darkening sky as they rode. Lisa leaned back against Mark's chest, tired but content. The steady rhythm of the horse's gait and the warmth of Mark's presence soothed her toward sleep. "Pa?" she murmured. "Yes. Little one? I'm glad we went to church today. The preacher and Henry, they're good people, aren't they?" Mark looked up at the emerging stars, remembering Henry's words about promises and truth. "Yes," he said softly. "God sends good people when we need them most." Lisa nodded sleepily, her small body relaxing further against him. Together they rode through the gathering dusk, their path lit by starlight and hope. Sunday dawned clear and cold, the kind of morning when breath hung visible in the air and frost sparkled on every fence post. Mark helped Lisa button up her best dress, freshly mended and pressed the night before. His own Sunday suit felt stiff and strange after years in the chest, but today called for proper respect. "You look right pretty," he said gruffly, adjusting the ribbon in her dark hair. Lisa smoothed her skirt nervously, eyes wide with anticipation and fear. They set out early, their horses' hooves crunching through frozen puddles. The white church stood sentinel against the pale winter sky, its steeple reaching toward heaven like a finger pointing the way. Already wagons and buggies lined the street, more than usual for a regular service. "Reckon word's gotten around," Mark muttered, helping Lisa down from the saddle. She pressed close to his side as they climbed the wooden steps, the treaty paper secure in his vest pocket. Inside, the church hummed with hushed conversations that died away as they entered. Dozens of eyes turned to watch them make their way down the center aisle. Lisa's grip on Mark's hand tightened, but she held her head high, just as they'd practiced. Henry Yazzie sat in one of the front pews, dressed in his finest clothes that blended Western cut with subtle Ute beadwork. He caught Lisa's eye and gave her a slight nod that seemed to steady her. Mark noticed how several townspeople who usually avoided Henry now leaned toward him, whispering questions. They settled into a pew near the front, Lisa between Mark and the aisle. Behind them, the murmuring continued. Mark caught fragments of conversation. "That's the girl. Treaty papers, I heard. Taking her in like that." The church bell tolled 9 times, its clear notes calling the congregation to order. Reverend Thomas emerged from his study, moving to stand behind the pulpit. His kind face surveyed the packed pews before he spoke. "Brothers and sisters," he began, his voice carrying to every corner, "today we gather not only for regular worship but to witness something important, a matter of justice, truth, and God's providence." The rustling of dresses and shuffling of boots stilled. Even the children, usually fidgeting by this point, sat attentive. "Mark Harlow," the preacher called. "Please come forward with Lisa." Mark's legs felt wooden as he stood. Lisa's small hand slipped into his as they walked to the front. The treaty paper crinkled softly in his vest pocket with each step. Facing the congregation, Mark saw faces he knew from years of trading and passing on the trail. The blacksmith who'd always been fair in his dealings, the mercantile owner who extended credit in hard times, women who'd helped nurse his wife in her final days. Some wore expressions of curiosity, others uncertainty. A few showed open skepticism. "Brothers and sisters," Mark began, his voice rough with emotion. "Most of you know me as a man who keeps to himself. After losing my Sarah and our little girl to the fever, I didn't reckon on having family again." He paused, gathering strength. "But God has his own ways of healing broken hearts." He told them then about finding Lisa that stormy night, how she'd tried to steal a crust of bread, starving and afraid, how her whispered question had broken through years of grief. As he spoke, he felt Lisa lean against him, drawing and giving courage. "She was abandoned on the trail," he continued, voice hardening, "cast aside by them that should have protected her, but she carried something precious without knowing it." He withdrew the treaty paper carefully, holding it up. "A promise made by our government to her mother's people, a right to land and water that can't rightfully be taken." Reverend Thomas stepped forward then, accepting the document. "I have examined this treaty," he announced. "It bears the proper seals and signatures. With your permission, Mark, I'll read it to the congregation." Mark nodded, guiding Lisa to sit on the front pew while the preacher began to read. The legal language filled the church, echoing off the wooden walls. When he reached the part specifying the rights granted to Lisa's mother's family, gasps rippled through the crowd. Henry stood quietly, moving to stand beside the preacher. "I have seen many such treaties," he said simply. "This one speaks true. The land it promises belongs to this child by right and law." A heavy silence fell. Mark watched the faces before him change as understanding sank in. He saw the moment when many of them realized that their prejudices had nearly made them party to a grave injustice. Mrs. Wilson, a widow known for her fine baking, was the first to move. She rose from her seat, clutching her handkerchief. "That poor child's been half-starved. Anyone can see it," she declared. "I'll bring by a proper supper this very afternoon, Mark Harlow, and don't you dare refuse it." Her words seemed to break a dam. Sarah Jenkins, who taught the town's school, stood next. "She ought to be learning her letters proper, Mr. Harlow. I can help with that, if you'd allow it." One by one, others joined in. The blacksmith offered to repair Mark's wagon free of charge so he could bring Lisa to town more easily. The mercantile owner's wife promised to find suitable fabric for new dresses. Even the children began smiling at Lisa, one little girl waving shyly from her mother's lap. Overwhelmed by this sudden outpouring, Mark found himself sinking to his knees. Lisa knelt beside him, her dark eyes bright with unshed tears. Together they bowed their heads as Reverend Thomas raised his hands in blessing. "Let us pray," the preacher intoned. "Heavenly Father, we thank you for opening our eyes and hearts today, for showing us that your family knows no boundaries of blood or race, for bringing this child to our community and teaching us to see your face in hers." "Amen," the congregation responded, the word swelling like a wave. As they rose, the organist began playing Amazing Grace. The familiar hymn filled the church, voices joining one by one until the harmony soared to the rafters. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, painting the scene in jewel-like colors: gold, ruby, sapphire, and emerald. Lisa stood close to Mark, her small hand still firmly in his. For the first time since finding her, he saw her shoulders truly relax, saw peace settle over her face like a blessing. No longer was she just the strange girl Mark Harlow had taken in. She was becoming part of something larger, a community that might learn to embrace instead of shun. The hymn continued, its promise of grace and redemption washing over them all. Mark felt his own heart lifting, years of solitude and grief giving way to something new. Here in this sacred space, surrounded by neighbors who were becoming family, he and Lisa had found more than acceptance. They had found belonging. Through the colored light and rising voices, Mark caught Henry's eye. The Ute Scout nodded once, satisfaction evident in his calm expression. They had done what needed doing, brought truth into the light, turned hearts toward justice, helped a community remember its better nature. As the last notes of the hymn faded away, Lisa squeezed Mark's hand and whispered, "Thank you, Pa." Her voice held all the trust and love he'd thought he'd never know again. The morning sun continued to pour through the windows, blessing them all with its warmth and light. In that moment, Mark knew with certainty that whatever challenges still lay ahead, they would face them together. Not just he and Lisa, but this whole community that had finally opened its heart to a child who needed nothing more than love and a place to belong. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the snow-dusted trail as Mark and Lisa rode toward home. Their horses' hooves made soft, crunching sounds in the fresh powder, and the crisp mountain air carried the scent of pine. Lisa sat in front of Mark on the saddle, humming one of the hymns from church, her small frame warm against his chest. "That was a mighty fine service today," Mark said, his voice gruff with lingering emotion. "Reckon folks showed their true hearts after all." Lisa nodded, her fingers playing with the horse's mane. "Mrs. Wilson said she'd teach me to make biscuits," she said softly, wonder still in her voice. "And Sarah Jenkins wants me to come to school." "That she does," Mark agreed, smiling into his beard. "Seems you've got yourself quite a few new friends now." The trail narrowed as they approached the line shack, winding between thick stands of pine and aspen. Shadows deepened in the growing dusk, and Mark felt Lisa shiver slightly. He pulled his coat tighter around them both. "Almost home," he assured her. "We'll have that fire built up right quick." A twig snapped in the darkness to their left. Mark's horse stopped, ears pricking forward. Before Mark could react, 3 shadows detached themselves from the trees. "Evening, Harlow," came Randall's voice, cold as the mountain air. 2 larger men flanked him, their faces hidden in the growing dark. Mark's hand instinctively tightened on Lisa's shoulder. "You're trespassing, Randall," he said evenly, though his heart hammered in his chest. "No, sir, I'm executing my duty as county agent." Randall's boots crunched in the snow as he stepped closer. "That girl is a ward of the territory now. Papers were signed this morning while you were playing at church." "You have no right," Mark began, but one of Randall's men had already grabbed the horse's bridle. The other circled behind them. "Lisa, run!" Mark shouted, trying to push her from the saddle toward the trees. But before she could move, rough hands seized her. Mark lunged after her, but the first man's fist caught him hard across the jaw. Stars exploded in his vision as he tumbled from the saddle. "Pa!" Lisa's terrified scream cut through the gathering darkness. "Pa, help me!" Mark struggled to his feet, tasting blood. The second man's boot caught him in the ribs, driving him back to his knees. Through blurred vision, he saw Randall mounting his own horse, Lisa struggling in his grip. "The law's the law, Harlow," Randall called back. "Best forget about her. She's headed where she belongs." "No!" Mark lunged forward again, but another blow sent him sprawling in the snow. By the time he could raise his head, the sound of galloping hooves was already fading into the distance. Lisa's cries grew fainter until they were swallowed by the winter twilight. "Lisa!" His shout echoed off the mountainside, unanswered. The hired men had vanished with Randall, leaving Mark alone in the gathering dark. Staggering to his feet, Mark whistled for his horse. The animal had bolted during the struggle but returned now, snorting nervously. Pain shot through Mark's side as he pulled himself into the saddle, but he ignored it, turning the horse's head toward town. For hours, he searched. He rode to every farm and homestead within miles, pounding on doors and questioning sleepy residents. No one had seen Randall or his men. No one knew where they might have taken Lisa. The moon rose and set, stars wheeling overhead in their cold dance. Mark's ribs screamed with every breath, his jaw swollen and throbbing, but still he searched. He followed trails until they disappeared into larger roads, called Lisa's name until his voice grew hoarse. Dawn was breaking when he finally turned back toward the line shack, hope crushed under exhaustion and despair. The cabin stood silent and dark, no smoke rising from the chimney, no light in the window. Inside, the hearth was cold and dead, gray ashes scattered where Lisa had helped build the fire just yesterday morning. Mark's legs gave out then. He sank into his chair by the cold fireplace, eyes fixed on Lisa's empty blanket still folded neatly on her pallet. Her few belongings lay scattered where she'd left them. The tin cup she used for drinking, the small rag doll Wilson had given her just that morning after church. Memories flooded him, sharp as knives. Lisa learning to split kindling, her face glowing with pride at each success. Lisa slowly sounding out words from Sarah's Bible, her finger carefully tracing each letter. Lisa calling him Pa for the first time, her voice so tentative and sweet it had nearly broken his heart. Now she was gone, taken by force, just as she had finally begun to feel safe. His second chance at family torn away as cruelly as the first. Mark's hands trembled as he reached for the Bible on the table. Opening it, he touched the treaty document still folded carefully between its pages. The paper that proved Lisa's rights, that had seemed like such a victory just hours ago, now felt like ashes in his mouth. "Lord," he whispered, his voice cracking, "I failed her. Just like I failed Sarah and Arcady when the fever came." His shoulders began to shake. I couldn't protect them, and now I couldn't protect Lisa. Tears fell onto the Bible's worn pages, the first he'd shed since his wife and daughter's deaths. Years of carefully maintained stoicism crumbled as grief overwhelmed him. The empty cabin echoed with his ragged breathing, the silence where Lisa's voice should be like a physical weight on his chest. Outside, the sun rose over the mountains, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold. But inside the line shack, Mark remained slumped in his chair, head bowed in despair, one hand gripping the Bible where Lisa's treaty lay hidden. The morning light crept across the floor, illuminating the cold hearth, the scattered belongings, the empty blanket, all the bitter evidence of another family lost, another heart broken on the unforgiving frontier. The morning sun cast harsh light on Mark's bruised face as he studied himself in the wash basin's clouded mirror. His jaw had swollen purple, and each breath sent sharp pains through his ribs. But physical hurts meant nothing compared to the hollow ache in his chest where Lisa's presence should be. He saddled his horse with careful movements, wincing as he tightened the cinch. The animal nickered softly, sensing his distress. "I know, old friend," Mark murmured, patting the horse's neck. "We're going to bring her home." The ride into town felt longer than usual. Each hoofbeat on the frozen ground echoed his determination. Mark had spent the night planning, grief hardening into resolve. He wouldn't let Lisa disappear into some orphan train or work camp, not while he drew breath. Main Street was already busy when he arrived, merchants opening their shops as the sun climbed higher. Mark noticed how some folks hurried to avoid his gaze, while others watched him with troubled expressions. News traveled fast in small towns. Outside the Mercantile, he overheard two women talking in hushed voices. "They've got that poor girl locked in the county barn," one whispered. "Sarah Wilson tried to bring her breakfast, but those men wouldn't let her near." "Ain't right," the other woman replied, shaking her head. "That child was just starting to bloom under Mark's care." Mark touched his hat brim as he passed them, his jaw clenched tight. The county barn sat at the edge of town, a sturdy structure used for storing equipment and occasionally housing prisoners when the sheriff's office was full. The thought of Lisa trapped there made his blood boil. He rode past slowly, noting two armed men lounging by the main doors. They straightened when they saw him, hands moving to their gun belts. Mark kept riding, but not before catching a glimpse of movement at one of the high windows. A small face quickly pulled back into shadow. His heart twisted. The church stood quiet and empty when Mark tied his horse outside. He found the preacher in his study, already bent over his Bible in morning devotions. The older man looked up as Mark entered, concern crossing his weathered features. "They've got her in the county barn," Mark said without preamble, his voice rough with emotion. "2 guards posted." The preacher closed his Bible carefully. "I heard. Sarah Wilson came by at dawn, quite distressed about the whole business." He studied Mark's bruised face. "Are you all right, brother?" "I failed her," Mark said, sinking into a chair. "I promised to protect her, and I let them take her." "You haven't failed anyone," the preacher said firmly. "The Lord doesn't measure our worth by our defeats, but by how we rise from them." He stood, moving to put a compassionate hand on Mark's shoulder. "We'll help you get her back." A knock at the study door interrupted them. Henry Yazzie stepped in, his dark eyes taking in Mark's condition with concern. The Ute Scout moved with his usual quiet grace, but tension showed in the set of his shoulders. "I came as soon as I heard," Henry said. 3 riders left town before dawn, heading east, probably to arrange the orphan train placement. Mark surged to his feet, ignoring the pain in his ribs. "We have to move fast then, before they can spirit her away." "Agreed," the preacher said, "but we must do this properly, legally. If we simply storm in there, Randall will have cause to arrest you and ship Lisa out even faster." Henry nodded. "The treaty gives Lisa rights, but only if witnessed and recorded. We need the town to see justice done." They gathered around the preacher's desk, voices low as they planned. Henry sketched a rough map of the county barn and surrounding buildings. The preacher made notes about which townspeople might stand as witnesses. Mark listened intently, his fingers working the brim of his hat. "Tomorrow's market day," the preacher said finally. "Most of the town will be out, including the sheriff and judge, if we present the treaty then, with enough respectable witnesses." "Randall won't be able to dismiss it," Henry finished. "Not without showing his true colors." Mark stared at the rough map, seeing Lisa's frightened face in his mind. "That's 24 hours away. She'll be terrified, alone in there." "She's stronger than you think," Henry said gently. "I saw it in her eyes. Apache blood runs deep. She knows how to endure." The preacher began writing letters, calling in favors from prominent townspeople who had shown sympathy in church. Henry left to quietly spread word among those who respected his judgment. Mark paced the study, his thoughts churning. "I won't fail her like the world failed me," he said finally, his voice low and fierce. "When Sarah and Katie died, I turned my back on everything, faith, community, hope itself. I let grief poison me." He touched the Bible in his coat pocket where Lisa's treaty lay. "But that girl brought me back to life, made me remember what it means to love, to trust in something bigger than my own pain." The preacher looked up from his writing, eyes warm with understanding. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, brother. Perhaps Lisa was sent to heal you as much as you were meant to protect her." As afternoon faded toward evening, they gathered again in the parsonage. The preacher had responses from several respected citizens willing to stand as witnesses. Henry reported that sympathy for Lisa ran strong among the townsfolk, especially after seeing her in church. "But Randall has powerful friends," Henry warned. "Railroad money, cattle interests. They won't give up easily." "Then we'll be stronger," Mark said simply. "For Lisa's sake." They reviewed the plan one final time as darkness fell. The preacher would call an impromptu town meeting after market opened. Henry would ensure the sheriff was present, and Mark would present the treaty publicly, forcing Randall to acknowledge its legitimacy or expose his corruption. "Remember," the preacher said, "our weapons are truth and witness, not violence. We must trust in justice." Mark nodded, though his hands ached to do more direct damage to the men who had hurt his girl. He stepped out onto the parsonage porch, breathing in the crisp night air. Above, stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, unchanged by human suffering or hope. "Hold on, little one," he whispered. "Your pa's coming for you." Inside him, grief and guilt had burned away, leaving only iron determination. He would not fail Lisa again. Whatever it took, whatever the cost, he would bring her home. The treaty in his pocket felt like a promise, not just of land and water rights, but of family restored, of wrongs made right. The night wind carried the scent of snow from the mountains. Tomorrow would bring either justice or deeper battle. But for now, Mark stood beneath the stars, his resolve burning bright and steady as a lamp in darkness, lighting the way home. Dawn broke crisp and clear that Sunday morning. Mark stood before his cabin's small mirror, carefully trimming his beard and smoothing his best shirt. His fingers trembled slightly as he fastened the buttons. So much rested on this day. The treaty paper lay on the table, carefully pressed between the pages of his Bible. He'd read it dozens of times now, memorizing every word. His gaze drifted to Lisa's empty bed in the corner, her small quilt still rumpled from the night she was taken. The sight strengthened his resolve. Hoofbeats outside announced Henry's arrival. The Ute Scout sat tall in his saddle, wearing a clean black coat over his usual buckskins. His dark eyes held quiet determination as he nodded to Mark. "The preacher is ready," Henry said. "He spent all night in prayer." Mark mounted his own horse, the treaty and Bible secure in his saddlebag. They rode in companionable silence, frost crunching under their horses' hooves. The morning sun painted the mountain peaks gold, but Mark barely noticed the beauty. His thoughts were fixed on Lisa, locked away in that county barn for nearly a week now. As they approached town, the church bell began to toll, its deep bronze voice calling the faithful to worship. Mark's heart quickened at the sound. How long had it been since he'd truly listened to those bells? Not since Sarah and Katie died, leaving him to his grief and solitude. But now the bells seemed to speak of hope, of justice, yet possible. They found the preacher waiting outside the church, greeting his congregation as they arrived. His weathered face brightened at their approach. "Brother Mark, Henry, the Lord goes before us today." Mark dismounted, retrieving his Bible. "Is she here yet?" The preacher nodded gravely. "Randall brought her in with the banker about 10 minutes ago. She looks tired, but unharmed." Through the church windows, Mark could see people settling into the wooden pews. His keen eyes picked out Randall and the banker near the front, their suits marking them as men of importance. Between them sat Lisa, her small frame nearly lost in their shadow. Even from outside, he could see how pale and drawn she looked. "Remember," Henry said softly, "we must let truth speak for itself. The treaty's power lies in witness." The preacher squeezed Mark's shoulder. "The congregation is ready. They've seen Lisa's gentle spirit these past weeks. Many hearts have already turned." They entered the church together, boots echoing on the wooden floor. Heads turned as they made their way down the center aisle. Mark caught glimpses of familiar faces, the widow who had offered food, children who had smiled at Lisa, farmers who knew the value of promised land. Randall's smug expression faltered slightly as they approached. The banker leaned over to whisper something in his ear. Lisa's eyes lit up at the sight of Mark, but she remained still, one of Randall's heavy hands resting on her shoulder in clear warning. The preacher mounted his pulpit as the last notes of the opening hymn faded away. He opened his Bible, but instead of beginning his sermon, he looked out over his congregation with solemn purpose. "Brothers and sisters," he began, "we gather today not just for worship, but for justice. The Lord commands us to care for the fatherless, to uphold the cause of the widow and orphan. Today, we are called to witness." He nodded to Mark, who stood. With steady hands, Mark withdrew the treaty from his Bible and held it high so all could see its official seals and signatures. "Many of you know me," Mark said, his voice carrying clear and strong. "You knew me when I had a family, my Sarah, my Katie. You knew me when I lost them to fever, how I turned away from everything, even God's mercy." He paused, emotion thick in his throat. "But the Lord wasn't finished with me." Murmurs rippled through the congregation as Mark described finding Lisa that snowy night, her desperate hunger, her whispered plea. He told of their slow-growing trust, of teaching her letters, of her calling him Pa for the first time. "I thought my heart was dead," he continued, "but that child brought it back to life. She reminded me what it means to love, to protect, to believe in something bigger than my own pain." He turned to face Randall directly now, treaty still raised. "This paper proves Lisa's right to land and water, inherited through her Apache mother's people. But it proves something more. That promises matter. That the weak shouldn't be crushed by the strong. That God's justice can still speak through human law." The preacher stepped down from his pulpit to stand beside Mark. "Friends, we've all seen how this child has bloomed under Brother Mark's care. We've heard her sweet voice joining our hymns. Are we now to stand silent while she's torn away, her birthright stolen?" Randall surged to his feet, face flushed. "This is irregular. The territory has procedures for dealing with vagrant children." "She ain't vagrant," a voice called from the congregation. It was the widow Wilson, standing straight despite her years. "She's got a home with Mark Harlow, and we all know it." "And treaty rights," Henry added quietly, but his voice carried. "Rights that some would rather ignore for profit." More people began standing. The blacksmith and his wife, several farmers, the schoolteacher. Even the sheriff rose slowly, his weathered face troubled as he looked at Lisa's pale features. "I've watched that girl," the schoolteacher said. "Seen her learning her letters, helping with chores. She's no vagrant. She's a child of this community now." The banker tugged at Randall's sleeve, whispering urgently, but Randall shook him off. "The territory's authority cannot override federal treaty law," the preacher interrupted firmly. "Not when witnessed and upheld by good people." Lisa's small voice suddenly cut through the tension. "Please," she said, looking up at Randall with surprising steadiness. "I want to go home with my pa." Those simple words seemed to break something in the room. More people stood, nodding, some with tears in their eyes. Mothers held their children closer. Men who had looked away before now met Mark's gaze with resolution. The sheriff stepped forward, his badge catching the light from the stained glass windows. "Agent Randall," he said quietly, "I reckon you'd best let that girl go to her father." Randall looked around the church, seeing support crumbling. The banker was already edging away from him, sensing the shift in power. His hand dropped from Lisa's shoulder. In that moment, Lisa moved. Quick as a deer, she darted past Randall and ran straight to Mark. He caught her in his arms, treaty paper crackling between them as she buried her face in his shirt. The congregation broke into scattered applause and amens. "It's all right now, little one," Mark whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "You're safe. You're home." The preacher raised his hands for quiet. "Let us pray," he said, giving thanks for justice restored, for family reunited, for promises kept. As heads bowed throughout the church, Mark held Lisa close, feeling her trembling gradually ease. Henry's hand rested supportively on his shoulder. Through the stained glass windows, morning sunlight poured in, painting them all in colors of hope. The congregation's Amen rose like thunder, sealing the moment in memory. When Mark looked up, he saw Randall slipping out the back door, but it didn't matter anymore. Lisa was safe. The treaty would be recorded. And most importantly, a community had chosen to stand for what was right. As the regular service resumed, Mark sat in the back pew, Lisa's small hand firmly in his. He noticed her other hand holding tight to Henry's sleeve, and his heart swelled with gratitude. They were more than witnesses now. They were family, bound by choice and faith and justice. The familiar hymns washed over them, speaking of mercy and redemption. Mark felt tears on his cheeks, but for the first time in years, they were tears of joy. The long winter of his grief had finally broken. Spring had come again to his heart, brought by a child's trust and a community's courage to stand for truth. The morning sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across the wooden pews of the small church. The congregation sat in tense silence as the preacher stepped forward, his Bible clutched firmly in weathered hands. His voice rang out clear and strong, filling every corner of the sanctuary. "Agent Randall," the preacher declared, fixing the county agent with a stern gaze, "you have no authority here to seize this child against the protection granted by federal treaty. This document," he gestured to the paper Mark still held, "bears the full weight of law and sacred promise." Randall's face flushed red with anger. "You forget yourself, preacher. The territory has procedures." "The territory's procedures don't override federal law," Henry spoke up from where he stood beside Lisa. His calm voice carried weight earned through years of bridging between worlds. "That treaty was signed in good faith. It protects Lisa's rights to land and water through her mother's people." The blacksmith, Tom Wilson, rose from his pew with deliberate slowness. His massive arms, hardened by years at the forge, crossed over his chest as he moved to stand between Randall's men and Lisa. "Reckon we've all seen enough of your kind of procedures, Agent Randall." 3 farmers followed his lead, the Peterson brothers and old Jake Murphy, their weathered faces set with determination as they formed a wall of flesh and conviction. More townspeople began to stand, creating a protective circle around Mark and Lisa. The banker, Herbert Mills, who had been hovering near Randall's shoulder, took several steps backward. His eyes darted between the angry faces of his neighbors and Randall's increasingly isolated position. With careful precision, he adjusted his vest and edged toward the church door. "This is outrageous!" Randall's voice cracked with fury. "I'll have you all brought up on charges of obstruction. The territorial court will—" A low rumble of derisive laughter cut through his threats. The widow Wilson's voice rose above the noise, sharp with scorn. "You go right ahead and try, Mr. High and Mighty Agent. We'll all testify about how you tried to steal a child's birthright." "And how you had your men rough up Mark Harlow," another voice added. "Don't forget about them missing cattle that ended up in your friend's herd," called someone else. The accusations flew like arrows, each one finding its mark. Randall's face shifted from red to pale as he realized how quickly his power was crumbling. Henry's hand rested steady on Lisa's shoulder, his presence a bulwark of calm in the storm of voices. "You are safe now, little sister," he murmured in his gentle way. "These good people see the truth at last." Lisa trembled slightly, but her chin lifted with growing confidence as she looked around at the faces of her defenders. These were the same townspeople who had once whispered and stared. Now they stood like a fortress around her, their expressions fierce with protective anger. Mark knelt beside his daughter, for that was truly what she had become, and gathered her close. His voice was rough with emotion as he whispered into her dark hair, "You're my girl now, Lisa. My daughter, in every way that matters. No piece of paper can make that more true, and no man can take it away." She buried her face in his shirt, her small fingers clutching the rough fabric. "Promise, Pa?" "I promise, little one. We're family now and always." The preacher raised his hands, calling for order in the chaos. "Brothers and sisters," his voice rolled out like thunder, "let us lift our voices in praise. Let us sing of God's justice and mercy." The organ wheezed to life, and the first notes of Amazing Grace filled the church. One by one, voices joined in, growing stronger with each verse. The hymn swelled until it seemed the very rafters must shake with its power. Randall tried to shout something about consequences, but his words were lost in the wall of sound. His face twisted with impotent rage as he realized his defeat was complete. With a final curse that even the hymn couldn't quite drown, he turned and stalked toward the door. His men followed, shoulders hunched, avoiding the glares of the congregation. The banker had already slipped out, no doubt to distance himself from the failed scheme. But inside the church, no one paid their departure much mind. The singing continued, voices lifted in triumph and joy. The widow Wilson appeared at Mark's elbow with a handkerchief, dabbing at tears that ran freely down her wrinkled cheeks. "Land sakes, but that's a beautiful sight," she said, beaming at Mark and Lisa. "A family made whole again, just as the good Lord intended." The blacksmith's wife pressed forward to squeeze Lisa's hand. "You'll come to Sunday dinner with us next week, won't you, dear? My Sarah's been hoping for a friend her age." More townspeople gathered around, offering welcomes and apologies, support and acceptance. The ice of suspicion had broken at last, melted by the warmth of shared purpose and righteousness. Henry watched it all with quiet satisfaction, his dark eyes crinkling at the corners. When the hymn ended, he touched Mark's shoulder. "The Creator works in strange ways, my friend. Sometimes it takes a child to teach grown hearts how to see clearly." The preacher called for another hymn, and again the church filled with music. Lisa's small voice joined in, tentative at first, then stronger. Mark held her close, his own voice rough with emotion but clear with joy. The morning sun climbed higher, pouring through the stained glass in rivers of color. Blue and gold and rose washed over the congregation, binding them together in light. They sang of amazing grace, of precious bonds, of being lost and then found. In the midst of it all, Lisa looked up at Mark with eyes that held no more shadows of fear. "Pa," she whispered during a pause between verses, "are we really home now?" Mark's heart swelled near to bursting as he looked at his daughter, this miracle child who had brought him back to life, back to faith, back to community. "Yes, little one," he answered, his voice thick with gratitude. "We're home." The singing rose again, carrying their joy to the heavens. The morning that had begun in tension now blazed with victory and hope. Randall's scheme lay in ruins, scattered by the united will of a town that had chosen to stand for justice. The preacher's wife appeared with her Sunday cake, cut into generous slices. Children who had once shied away from Lisa now crowded close, offering shy smiles and sharing sweets. Their parents spoke of plans, Sunday dinners, sewing circles, spelling lessons at the school. Through it all, Mark kept one arm around Lisa's shoulders, anchoring her in this new reality of acceptance and belonging. Henry remained nearby, his steady presence a reminder of bridges built and prejudices overcome. The morning service transformed into an impromptu celebration of family restored and community renewed. Even the most hardened hearts had softened, touched by the sight of a lonely man and a lost girl finding their way home to each other. Outside, the spring sun climbed toward noon, warming the earth after the long winter. Inside the church, light and song and joy mingled together, painting a picture of grace made visible through the simple courage of ordinary people choosing to do what was right. In the quiet days that followed the church confrontation, Mark and Lisa settled into a new rhythm of hope. The preacher, Reverend Thomas, visited their cabin early one morning, bringing papers and guidance for proper adoption proceedings. "We'll need to file these with the territorial court," he explained, spreading documents across Mark's rough-hewn table. "Testimonies from townsfolk about your care of Lisa will help make this binding." Mark's weathered hands traced the formal lettering on the papers. "Reckon I never thought I'd be doing this again," he said softly. "Being a father, proper and legal-like." Lisa hovered nearby as they worked, unwilling to let Mark out of her sight. Her dark eyes followed his every movement, as if afraid he might disappear if she looked away too long. When he noticed her anxious watching, he'd give her a gentle smile that seemed to steady her fears. The widow Wilson arrived with a steaming chicken pie, followed by Mrs. Peterson bearing fresh bread. "Just a few things to tide you folks over," they said, their offerings speaking louder than words about the town's change of heart. Henry stopped by to say farewell before heading out to scout. "I'll return when the adoption hearing comes," he promised, clasping Mark's hand. To Lisa, he added with a warm smile, "Keep teaching your father about the old ways, little sister. He has much to learn." That evening, As shadows lengthened across the cabin floor, Mark and Lisa sat down to supper together. The lamplight cast a gentle glow across her face, catching the smile that came more easily now. She ate with careful manners, no longer haunted by memories of hunger. After the dishes were cleared, Lisa disappeared outside briefly, returning with arms full of fresh pine boughs. Mark watched, throat tight with emotion, as she arranged them carefully along the stone mantel. "Ma used to do this," she explained softly. "Said it makes a house smell like home." The fresh scent of pine filled the cabin, mingling with wood smoke and cooking aromas. Mark looked around at walls that had witnessed his lonely grief for so long, now warming with new life and purpose. His daughter, soon to be his by-law as well as heart, was bringing spring inside, one small gesture at a time. The weeks slipped by like snowflakes, each day bringing deeper winter to the Colorado highlands. Mark and Lisa fell into comfortable patterns: morning chores, Bible lessons by lamplight, and shared meals that grew more plentiful as neighbors continued bringing offerings of friendship. One crisp morning, hoofbeats announced Reverend Thomas's arrival. His breath clouded in the cold air as he dismounted, clutching a leather folder to his chest. Inside the cabin, he pulled out official papers bearing multiple signatures and territorial seals. "It's done," he announced, eyes twinkling. "All legal and proper?" Mark's hands trembled as he read the documents. He set them carefully on the table, then knelt down on one knee so he could look directly into Lisa's eyes. His weathered hands settled gently on her small shoulders. "You're mine now," he said, voice rough with emotion. "And I'm yours. Nobody can ever take you away again." Lisa's face brightened like sunrise on fresh snow. Tears welled in her dark eyes, but her smile outshone them. She threw her arms around Mark's neck, burying her face in his shoulder. He held her close, his own eyes damp beneath his graying hair. As evening approached, the cabin that had known such loneliness filled with warmth and fellowship. Neighbors arrived bearing covered dishes, Mrs. Wilson's fresh bread still steaming, 3 different fruit pies, and mason jars of preserved vegetables. The preacher's wife brought a cake decorated with sugar frosting. Lanterns cast golden light across familiar faces as everyone gathered inside. Someone started singing Amazing Grace, and others joined in, their voices rising in harmony. The hymn filled every corner of the cabin, wrapping around them like a warm blanket. Lisa moved among the guests, helping serve pie and accepting congratulations. Her laughter rang out clear and free, no longer weighed down by fear or hunger. She belonged now, truly and legally, with papers to prove it. Mark stood near the fireplace, watching his daughter with pride and gratitude. The empty ache that had lived so long in his chest was gone, replaced by something warmer and brighter. God's grace, he reckoned, worked in mysterious ways, bringing light from darkness, family from loneliness, and turning a simple line shack into a true home filled with love. Evening settled softly over the Colorado highlands, the world outside hushed beneath deep snow. Inside the cabin, lamplight cast warm shadows across wooden walls that had witnessed so much change. The familiar scent of pine smoke mingled with bubbling stew, making the space feel snug against winter's chill. Lisa moved with careful purpose, setting their worn tin plates on the table. Her small hands arranged each spoon just so, and she hummed softly, an Apache lullaby her mother had taught her, its melody filling the cabin with gentle sound. The girl who had once crept in like a frightened shadow now moved with the confidence of belonging. Mark sat at the table, his graying head bowed, weathered hands that knew hard work clasped together as he began to pray. "Lord," he started, voice rough with emotion, "I thank you for second chances, for showing that family ain't just about blood, but about mercy." His words stumbled a bit, unused to speaking his heart so openly. Lisa's giggle, bright as spring water, broke through his solemnity. The sound made his own lips twitch into a smile, even as he finished the prayer. She settled across from him, their eyes meeting with shared understanding as they began their evening meal. After the dishes were cleaned, Lisa curled up near the crackling fire, Mark's old Bible open on her lap. Her finger traced each word slowly, sounding out letters he'd patiently taught her over these months. Lamplight caught the determined furrow of her brow as she practiced. Mark watched from his chair, overwhelmed by how far they'd come from that desperate night when a starving child had slipped through his door. Tears gathered in his eyes, but he didn't brush them away. Instead, he whispered across the quiet room, "No, child. Never again will you be starved or cast aside." Lisa looked up from her reading, her face glowing in the firelight. "I know, Pa," she answered, her voice steady and sure, filled with trust that had been hard-won. The fire popped and crackled, sending sparks up the chimney. Its warmth wrapped around them both, father and daughter bound together by choice and faith, their new beginning as solid as the cabin's foundation beneath them. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.